everybody. Welcome to Just Talk Live, Faith and Justice Talk Show. And Destiny, we have missed you for the past 2 weeks.
I know, I missed you as well, and all of our participants. But I hear my gal Mel did a great job. So thank you, Mel, for filling in. It's always nice to know you have someone that can step in, right away on cue to take your place. And I can go and just be on vacation and relax and know that Lee is in good hands. So thank you so much, Mel.
Yeah, thank you, Mel. If you're watching out there, you're always welcome to be with us. And yeah, it was a good time. We talked about the border and immigration last week, and we just sent out the May schedule. So if you check out the social media, Unbound social media, it's out there. The May schedule is coming up, which is next week, which is hard to believe that we are in May. And next month, we're going to be talking, the first episode will be about purity culture, which is much needed for us to discuss. And we'll have a second part to the Stop AAPI Hate with Irene Cho. And we'll talk about Queer in the Family, which is a new series in Unbound. And we're going to be having another evening with an author. So
sounds like exciting. A great lineup. Yeah, it's a great lineup. Stay tuned. You don't want to miss it.
So let us get started on a topic that we always need to talk about.
Right.
Gun violence. So let us welcome our guest for this evening. Welcome, everybody.
Yes. We are so glad you're able to join us tonight to talk about this very important and timely topic. But before we dive into our discussion, we just want you all to introduce yourselves, let us know anything you think that we might need to know as hosts, as audience, as participants that are listening, to help understand your perspective for this conversation, and for them just to know a little bit more about you and the expertise that you bring. So we'll start with Catherine, then Mike, and then we'll end with Deanna.
Thank you so much, Destiny and Lee. I'm really excited to be with y'all today and to be able to have this vital and important conversation. My name is Catherine Fleischer. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a graduating senior at the University of Pittsburgh. I am also the executive director and founder of Not My Generation, a nonprofit committed to localized intersectional gun violence prevention advocacy for young adults. I also, while being a student and heading up Not My Generation, work on more localized work through a state project a close friend of mine and I founded called No Cop Money PA, where we work to dismantle the police state in Pennsylvania by disrupting relationships between elected officials and the Fraternal Order of Police. Beyond that, I'm also involved in the faith-based advocacy world. I am on the Commission on Social Action, which is the governing body for the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, where I focus on gun violence prevention efforts and have for a number of years. So that's a little on me. I'm really excited to talk with y'all and have a really important conversation today.
Thank you, Catherine. After the show sometime or in the near future, we have to have a sidebar. I'm from Pennsylvania too. So yeah. Mike?
Yeah, I'm also from Pennsylvania. I'm in Colorado Springs now, but I'm founder and executive director of Raw Tools. We turn guns into garden tools and work out of programming, War No More nonviolence training, but also introducing some new programming this year, talking about systemic reformation or abolish, wherever you're at on kind of that spectrum. We're working at different programs with that. Also co-author of Beating Guns with Shane Claiborne that came out in 2019. Really grateful we got to do a 37-city book tour before COVID came down on the world. So looking forward to this conversation. Thanks so much for having us here, Lee and Destiny.
Hi, Deanna Hollis. I am the Gun Violence Prevention Ministry Coordinator for the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship. And I am not from Pennsylvania, but my son lives there. And I was born and raised. I'm Texan, native Texan, came from the Panhandle part of Texas and was raised to a family of gun owners. And so I became involved in this work whenever Texas passed a law in 2016 allowing guns on college campus. So it was being a mom that got me involved in seeing how my daughter's friends responded to the law. They did exactly as was intended, and they saw it as an invitation to buy arms. And so there was a young man who was courting her and came over to have dinner at my table. And as he was sitting down, he said he was counting down the days till his 21st birthday so that he could go out and buy and get his concealed handgun license. And when I listened to him talk about it more, it was clear to me that he didn't, he saw that having the gun was going to instantly turn him into Jason Bourne, in which he was going to be able to take down every bad guy that there was. And I was like, this is having a background around guns. I knew that this was not the way it was going to happen. And I also just wanted to name this concealed handgun license is what prevented him from getting a gun, because tomorrow I'll be driving to Austin to the Texas State Legislature as we are there is a bill to remove our concealed handgun license, our permitting system. And so I will be going to speak before the Texas Legislature against that bill on behalf of faith leaders throughout the state of Texas.
Yeah, and that is why one of the reasons why we are having this discussion tonight is the legislation in multiple states, one being also here in where I'm at in Tennessee, and also the recent mass shootings, and just how we are as people of faith, how we are to navigate and be within these kinds of conversations. But I do think it's important for everyone watching, for us to kind of put everything into context. Like, and I will preface this because I watched a show in the UK. It's a police show. I like British television, everyone, and I noticed that. And obviously they don't have it perfect there, but I noticed that even in a TV show, there's not a focus on guns. And so it's a very different like posture that people in the UK have toward guns. And then in contrast to here, where it's so ingrained. And so I would start off just asking, how did we get to this place? How did we get to guns being so, intertwined in the identity of this country, almost, well, to the point of idolatry, really? And so I think that's a good place for us to start. So how did we get here, Catherine? We'll start with Catherine, and we'll go in the same order, Mike and then Deanna.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a really important one. And I certainly don't have all of the answers, but I'll start with some of the ones that I think are most important, and that I think about a lot. So first of all, when we talk about gun violence, we typically talk about, the firearms themselves. We talk about mass shooting deaths. We talk about, differences in types of firearms, all of those pieces. But something we don't often talk about is what issues have led to such systemic gun violence. What issues not only have taken the gun culture and the prevalence of guns in the United States and elevated it to the point of a public health crisis. And so that's what I want to focus on, and that's what I'm going to urge us to talk about today when we're talking about gun violence, which is looking beyond just guns and understanding that gun violence is really a symptom of a lot of other systemic injustices, mostly having to do with class and race injustice. And so it's important that we also name that gun violence is not just mass shootings. It is also community violence. It is also police violence. It is also domestic violence. It is also suicide. It is also accidental shootings. It's also hate crimes. There are just so many different ways that gun violence can look. And so, the presence of guns just exacerbates so many other systemic injustices that, we get to a point that we truly are at epidemic proportions in terms of deaths and injuries from gun violence each year. But I think the place to start, if we're looking at, a linear history of the United States, is that we have to remember that this country was founded basically by beginning a genocide of the native peoples in the United States. And the way that required violence from the very founding of this nation, that we required a violence based on a racial and ethnic hierarchy. And so that kind of, to me, screams, we're starting from a foundation of violence, we're starting from a foundation of racism, we're starting from a foundation of imperialism. And that's very clear to me when we look at the history of this nation and of the prevalence of gun violence. Obviously, I'm skipping through a lot of history by jumping from, Native Americans all the way up through, more contemporary times. But really, it's that, we've allowed special interests like the NRA and messaging that's absolutist to allow us to think that we have a binary choice of like guns or no guns. And first of all, that's not how that works. Happy to talk about all the other policy alternatives in the middle. But also, it's about, if we met people's needs in different kinds of ways, having to do with mental health and meeting people's basic needs, there would be a lot less gun violence because there would be a lot less reason for it and a lot less disaffected communities. So I apologize if I jumped around a little bit, but I just wanted to throw out a couple of things to get them on the table right away so that I could pass it over to Mike and Deanna so that we can, talk about like how else we got here, keeping in mind that our country was founded via genocide of Native peoples and that violence is very much ingrained in the American idea.
Yeah, that's 100% correct. I completely agree. The Native Americans often called the revolver the spirit gun because it was so effective at genocide, and that it was so effective in wiping out all of their people so that white settlers could take their space. And the first Supreme Court case to talk about gun control was to keep it out of Black and brown bodies' hands, and that when guns are used as a way to defend yourselves, it was okay for white people, but it wasn't okay for people of color to do that. And so while we talk about how inundated with guns that we are here in America, we make a gun every 3 seconds in this country. At Raw Tools, on average, we make 3 tools out of every gun that we disable and turn into garden tools. So that's one way that we kind of fight back with that narrative. But we also are just gun violence and guns themselves are inherent in our makeup as a country. It's something that, like Catherine said, is just a part of who we are from the very beginning. And it's a tool that we've used. There's one of my favorite terms is cyborg anthropology, where it talks about, if you think about anthropology or an archaeologist in the future digging up our civilization and they're going to find guns upon guns upon guns. And they'll talk about how we use that as a tool to solve conflict at all those intersections that Catherine mentioned. And you can say that, when we try something, it's good to give 110%. Well, America gives 110% in the way that 110 people die every day from gun violence. And 10 of those, the extra percent, are kids who are finding loaded and unsafely stored guns in the home or cars, and those accidental shootings that Catherine mentioned. So it's a part of our identity. And I think the church has a unique space to be able to be in conversation and dialogue against that kind of history that people will start to dig. And the church has an opportunity to give a different narrative when people are looking at our culture, 100 years from now.
Thanks. And I want to add something that I got from this book right here, Beating Guns by Mike Martin and Shane Claiborne. In that they have a chapter here called I think it's Gun History 101, in which as Catherine said, we were founded on the gun. But that in that Second Amendment, we always get the story that it was there for in case we need to defend ourselves against this tyrannical government. Well, what's not said is the tyrannical government that they were afraid of was this newly formed government that was going to take away their slaves. So that Second Amendment was actually Virginia wouldn't ratify the Constitution without it, because they wanted to be able to have slave patrols. And it was the law then that every white man had to have a gun in order, and it was their responsibility to maintain slavery. So it's this white supremacy and capitalism, because it's also the gun industry. So what they outline in Beating Guns is that after the Civil War, well, it was at the turn of the Civil War when the gun went from being made by blacksmiths, individuals that could make lots of things, to being then automated, thanks to Eli Whitney. Anyway, the cotton gin. Sorry, and he. So he allowed for this interchangeable parts, which allowed the gun to now be automated. And so then there was the creation of gun manufacturers. Well, after the Civil War, they actually went bankrupt. And so they're like Remington started making typewriters and sewing machines, but guns were more profitable. So they went to the US government and they said, because at that time, the only customer for these manufacturers were the US government. And so whenever they said, we need customers, because peace does not sell guns. And if you want to have guns in order to fight your wars, we're going to need to have a market for these guns. So that was when the US began to create the gun market. And one of the first things that they did was they started to create what's called the Boy Plan, in which they specifically marketed to young men between the ages of 10 to 16. So the gun industry knew that if you could get this into the psyche of the American male, you would have customers for life. And so therefore, now those dads would then teach their kids, and so on and so on. It would pass down. And so that would normalize guns into our society. It would make it part of just what it means to live. We can't imagine a different way. And that is what is still happening. So this laws with these concealed handgun license, this permitless carry that they're trying to remove here, it serves one purpose and one purpose only, to do away with that law, is to make it easier to sell guns. So you have to realize the gun is a non-consumable product. So that means a gun's not going to wear out. A gun's not going to be something that you need to buy another one. So like my husband, he has a rifle. It's a 1903 Springfield. It still works. Technically, he doesn't need to buy another gun. But you've got these gun manufacturers that need to sell guns. So there's the ATF has a report, and I like to go to this report and show it to folks, and it shows the history of guns manufactured. And up until about 2008, they remained pretty steady, around 3,000 to 4,000. But in 2008, we start to see a sharp uptick in the number of guns manufactured. And what's really striking, and there's kind of three reasons for this to happen. And one is, I think social media was up and running by that time. And so disinformation could be assimilated very easily. You had the election of Barack Obama. And the third thing is that you have that Supreme Court decision where Heller, for the first time, begins to interpret the Second Amendment as an individual right versus a collective right. And that's a direct result of the NRA and the lobbying and the work that they did to shift our culture. And so that it was always about gun sales. Everything is about gun sales. And so when you go to the year 2013, that's the first really sharp increase in gun sales. Do you know what happened in December of 2012? Sandy Hook. And so everybody always asks, why didn't we get any legislation? If it's not going to happen then, when is it going to happen? Well, the reason why it didn't happen is because the brutal fact is killing kindergartners sold guns. And so that's why our lawmakers that are beholden to gun industry profits continue to make guns as available as they possibly can, because it's really hard to sell a non-consumable product in a saturated market. In this country, we have more guns than we have people. And so like any product, you either need to get your customers to buy again, but as a friend of mine likes to say, it's really hard to convince somebody with 15 Barbies that they need another Barbie. So what do you need? You need new customers. And what's the best way to get new customers? You got to generate fear, you got to generate distrust, and you got to make that avenue as open as it possibly can. So any type of restriction on a gun, like we could have things like smart technology, but guess what? If an authorized gun buyer gets their gun stolen, well, guess who's got to go buy a new gun? That's good news if you're in the gun business, right? So you don't want to do anything that's gonna to limit guns being stolen. You know, why would we not have a law? People say, why would we not have a law that makes it mandatory that you have to report if your gun gets stolen? Well, it's because they want guns stolen, right? Get you a new, that's another customer, that's another buy. You know, the time that we've been in this past year has been record-setting gun sales, record-setting. So again, there is nothing, if you are beholden to gun industry profits to motivate you to do anything that is remotely going to be peaceful, right? You want distress. You want people to be afraid. And so I think that's really where we are now today, like where all this has gone, that the number one thing that's driving this is gun industry profits. It's capitalism. It's money. And that's what we're up against. That's why the laws aren't getting passed. It's shifting. And that's, I think, something we might talk about next. But right now, that's what it is. It's pure and simple gun sales, not public safety, gun profits.
Yeah, thank you, Deanna, you did help shift the conversation for the next question. You all mentioned a lot of history that has come up around how we got here, you know, the start of our country leading all the way up to some of the violence that we've seen, not only nationally, but in individual communities. But I want to ask you all individually, what are some of the work that you're doing to combat those narratives and to organize and to lift the issue up of gun violence? And at that time, if you're doing the work, can you elaborate more about some of the bills and laws that you're either lobbying for or against, and any work that your community is doing and how others can support it? And we'll mix it up. We'll go with Mike, then Deanna, then Catherine.
Yeah, so Raw Tools doesn't focus too much on legislation and advocacy because there's so many organizations already doing that. So we partner with a lot of those organizations. We're in Colorado Springs, and the shooting in Boulder happened right across the street from Boulder Mennonite Church, and that's who I'm licensed for the ministry of Raw Tools through the Mennonite Church. And so what we did on Good Friday, which was the week after the shooting, we held a vigil, and we brought our forge and anvil up to the church parking lot across the street from the parking lot of King Soopers. And we had kind of an open, instead of like an open mic, it was an open anvil, and people could take the hammer and take a turn helping us make a garden tool. And it was a really beautiful way for folks to kind of release some grief, some anger, sadness, all those emotions, that shock that you feel after another mass shooting, especially when it's the grocery store that you frequent all the time, and it could have been you. But it's an echo of something that we've been doing for a long time. We started that December of 2012 after Sandy Hook. We started 2 months later and started turning guns into garden tools. And one of the things that we learned along the way is that when we involve the victims and survivors of gun violence in this process, they're the ones that support and really are carrying way too much weight in this fight, and that really are asking many of us to get behind. And so one of the events that first we invited folks to share their story about their interaction and trauma of gun violence, but after that they took the hammer and they could say something, a prayer, a name, as they hit. And it was then that they began to realize in us too that we need healthy ways to bring our pain to speech, where we're not punching a wall, where we're not becoming a part of a victim offender cycle and going and buying a gun ourselves. And it's at that point where when we can inform the community that this trauma is something that people live with for the rest of their lives, that they're in grief about that, they're working and healing every day, but it's still a part of their process every day. And I think we don't see that as often, and especially with most of the shooting outside of anything you see on media. So outside of police shootings and mass shootings, it's hard you don't get to hear it unless it's someone you know. And so it's important for communities to understand that 20 years afterwards, this is the first time that victim felt like they had a healthy way to get rid of and process some of that grief and pain and anger without punching a wall and causing harm to themselves or others. And so we're working with Boulder Mennonite and also several other churches in Boulder. We're going to be having a buyback in June that is fully funded by these churches. We also had, before the shooting was planned, kind of a roundtable with workshops, documenting, screening, panel sessions, and Shane and I will be preaching on that following Sunday in June. The end of the last weekend in June, where we're going to be bringing some faith communities together to talk about this issue. And it's something that we have to continually be educated about, because the policy is continually changing. There are all kinds of options that we can do. One of the things that Colorado just passed was the requirement to report a stolen gun. Some cities had required it, or counties, but not the state. And so the state has required that. They've also required safe storage when you're not at home with your firearm, so that if someone does steal it or something happens and it wasn't stored safely, then you're held responsible for that as well. So there's a lot of those little pieces of policy that have nothing to do with preventing someone from owning a gun, but it has everything to do with being responsible as a gun owner. And there's more that Raw Tools would advocate for, that, even outside of that 1903 Springfield that Deanna's husband has, it's hard for me to imagine the need for a gun, because it just causes so much more harm than it does to bring about any kind of worthwhile conflict resolution, whether that's a conflict within myself and suicide, or a conflict with a peer or neighbor, because if we're defining our neighbor, that really extends forever, as Jesus told us. So it's hard to want to fight against gun violence while also trying to prepare in some ways to defend yourself by pulling a trigger. So that can be a conversation maybe later here.
Thanks, Mike. So my role as the ministry coordinator, gun violence prevention ministry coordinator, is to listen to people like Mike, and to listen to people like Catherine and the work that they're doing, and to coordinate with all kinds of different people within the gun violence prevention movement. So we have really wide lens and a wide boundary for kind of what we advocate for, but mainly the role is within the church, to be able to get the church to be informed and active in preventing gun violence in whatever form that looks like. And so it can take on advocacy for legislation. And I also think the work that Mike is doing is something that the church can do to become disarming congregations, to where we actually are this witness. One of the things that our Book of Order says is that there's 6 great ends of the church, and one of those is exhibition of the kingdom of heaven to the world. And so this is one way that we can live into that great end of the church, is to be able to be a part of co-creating with God, to actually be embodying and helping to make manifest that world that we want to live in by disarming these weapons. And we are also looking at, so at the last General Assembly, there was a overture that was put forward in order to relook at our own, the PCUSA gun violence prevention policy. The policy was approved in 2010, so it's over 10 years old, and a lot has changed in 10 years. So it was to go back and look at the policy and to update it, and to particularly then ask, what lens are we looking at this through? Whose voices were we listening to? And so to make sure that we are listening to the voices of those that are impacted by gun violence, as opposed to just the gun owners. And so that is, where being a disarming congregation, like how Mike said, you get the chance to listen to those that have been impacted by gun violence. You be able to actually have that interpersonal relationship, which I think is what really helps people take action. It's I'll be real. My senator is Ted Cruz. If that was what you told me, that's how I need to do in gun violence is to call Ted Cruz on the regular, I'm done, right? Like there's nothing for me to do. So it's the being engaged in the people that are impacted and hearing those stories. But also as we shift our policy, I think that, and that's what I hope Catherine is going to talk about, is that, and I hope folks are listening to the work they've done, because I think they've done this work. They've been listening to the voices of those that are impacted. They've been listening to people of color. They've been listening to youth, and they have been, listening to women, because these are people that are most impacted by gun violence that often don't get a voice or a place at the table. And so that's what we'll be doing over the next year, is really starting to listen to folks to rethink what the PCUSA policy might look like to be more encompassing of those that are impacted.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm gonna pick right up on that train of thought about listening to victims and centering the people who are closest to pain, as the people who then should then be the closest to power, to pick up those issues and to advocate for themselves in the way that them and their communities need. So in service of those goals, Not My Generation has been spearheading a project that we call Depolicing GVP, with a number of partner organizations, including the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, but also including some March for Our Lives state groups, Concerned Citizens of DC, Future Coalition, Youth Over Guns, Meddling Kids Movement, Revolutionaries Demanding Justice, and the Episcopal Peace Fellowship. And in collaboration with all of these organizations, we went through a multi-month process where we reviewed legislation, best practices, policy playbooks, local legislation, talked to partners on the ground who are doing police and prison abolition work, who are doing gun violence prevention work and domestic violence prevention, and youth services and LGBTQ services, and all these different people who had a different kind of vested interest in ending gun violence and protecting the people in their communities rather than protecting guns. Although when I say protecting guns, I really mean protecting capitalism and special interests, as we discussed earlier, but I digress because we've already talked about that a little bit. We had these conversations and tried to think through together in a collaborative environment, taking into consideration people on the ground who have been in this work, some for decades and decades, and some, since they became personally involved through one incident or another over the course of their lifetime. And we thought about, what would public safety look like without a reliance on police and prisons? What does public safety and justice and compassion in a community look like when we aren't reliant on punishment, but we're reliant on community, when we're not reliant on fear and individualism, but on collectivism and supporting one another when we fall, instead of taking, being worried that we're going to be taken advantage of. And so in centering those pieces, we wrote about an 80-page policy playbook for depolicing gun violence prevention that really rests on 4 main pillars. The first being community empowerment, which includes policies and approaches localized around creating pathways to true democracy and protecting voter rights, reimagining our education system, protecting and empowering the most marginalized, creating a new standard for gun ownership, implementing community control over policing or police abolition, empowering tenants in low-income households, building a new economy for the many instead of the few, and providing critical resources for victims of domestic violence. That's kind of the first pillar. The second pillar is creating counter structures. So, if let's say we do abolish policing, or let's say we do, think about what creating a new economy for the many looks like, what fills that place, right? And I think like one of the big reasons that we often come to a stalemate politically around these issues is that we've been so indoctrinated with rhetoric and hypotheticals about safety and violence and guns and the quote unquote bad guy that we're all supposed to imagine as a person of color, and we think about those things, about how we undo them, and how we see beyond what we've been told is possible to think about how we could organize society and our communities differently to fill the needs of people that goes beyond what we have today. So that's kind of the point of building counter structures, and the two main ones we focused on was creating a new path for healthcare in America, and ensuring that healthcare is not employment based, so that everybody has access to it, and also that healthcare for all covers mental health care for all, because we know that 2/3 of gun deaths each year, of those 40,000 people roughly who die each year, are suicide by firearm. And we know that although suicide, you can, go about it in a number of different ways, people who use guns are far, far more likely to be successful in their attempts. And so we know that if we can limit access to guns when somebody is having a mental health crisis, or limit their crises in general by giving them opportunities to receive mental health care, we can directly impact the rates of gun violence by reducing suicides. And then the second piece under creating counterstructures was investing in proven alternatives to the police, thinking about, again, community control, thinking about abolition, thinking about demilitarization of state forces. The third pillar is healing from pain. And that really is just what it sounds like. It's about serving survivors. It's about housing justice. It's about healing without financial fears. It's about bearing the costs of burying a loved one. And a lot of these healing from pain pieces have to do with, pieces that have just for too long gone entirely, absent from the public sphere. We have this epidemic of gun violence that disproportionately affects communities who are already experiencing, health disparities, that are already experiencing environmental racism, who are already experiencing, reduced access to, education in schools. So we take communities who have been victimized repeatedly, and we tell them that their costs and their healing and, help for survivors and support for families who've lost someone to gun violence, that's their own problem. But that's like an individual problem separate from everybody else. And that is just ignoring the reality that the state has a role to play in gun violence, and that the state should then have a role to play in rectifying that. And we also think that part of healing from pain too is thinking really explicitly about racial justice in this country, and the need for reparations, and the need to actually reckon with our extremely racist building blocks upon which this country is built. And then that fourth and final pillar is social, political, and structural accountability, right? So how do we ensure that this isn't just one-off changes? How do we ensure that this is sustainable moving forward? And the three pieces that fall under that pillar are removing blanket federal protections for policing, so things like ending qualified immunity, dismantling police unions, etc. Centering rehabilitative justice. We know that just putting people in prison who violate some sort of gun law is not the answer. And we also know that laws that restrict access to guns, like raising minimum purchasing ages, tend to be over-enforced in areas where the communities are already over-policed and over-criminalized. So you can read that as, Black and brown and low income communities. So how do we center rehabilitative justice? How do we move away from thinking about prison and punitive punishment, and instead think about how to provide supports and true healing and rehabilitation for people who've, either been victimized or who have victimized others. And then finally is gun industry accountability. Like we've talked about, really coming to a reckoning about all of the incredible damage that industry has caused to this nation and the people in it. So that's a little bit about our depolicing work. So we have a number of policies outlined under each of those. I will share a link to the policy playbook so that folks who are watching can look at that in detail, so that you can, let us know if you have questions. You can personally or organizationally endorse the playbook. But that's really like the bread and butter of what Not My Generation advocates for in terms of our policy work. We are a national organization, but we have chapters. We call them coalitions because we're really looking to bring different people to the table, not like build a membership per se. So our coalitions across the country do local work around some of these policies outlined in the playbook. And while we are very locally focused and provide a national support system for that local focus, I do also want to name that federal gun legislation is still really important. And I think sometimes we get hung up on the fact that it hasn't passed in a long time and it's so divisive. But in reality, no matter what individual states do, if the neighboring state has the most lax gun laws in the country, there's going to be gun trafficking across borders. There are 50 states in this country, and until all 50 have, and DC, have more strict gun policy and more supports for people who are vulnerable to gun violence, we're not going to be able to solve this problem. So that's on that. And I'm also going to send another link, sorry, to the Giffords Law Center scorecard, which has state-by-state information about gun laws that, compare everything, put in order, who has the most gun deaths, who has the most stringent gun laws, and help see where your state falls in that. So that you can help identify where your state still needs to go, so that you can, take something like this playbook, put it into conversation with something like Giffords scorecard, and think about what your community, what your state needs the most, and how you can move forward in advocating for those pieces.
Awesome. Thank you, Catherine, Deanna, and Mike for sharing about the work that you do. Getting down to the root causes, but also the creativeness of transforming something that brings death into something that brings life, as a gardening tool does. That's very powerful. And I hope whoever's watching that we can continue to think creatively about how to continue to do this work as well. Y'all all touched on that with recent, recent mass shootings, and that we would hope that after them that something will happen federally. And I just wonder, will there something different happen? We have a new administration, and we will put in a disclaimer. We always have to. We do not endorse a political party or a political person. That is our disclaimer for this episode. We always have to say that these days. But there is another administration that has very different ideas and ways of going. And I wonder if y'all do feel some sense of hope in the future that something may happen, or will it just be another empty conversation? I just wonder about that from each of you. Is there a little hope federally? I know y'all talked about the work that y'all are doing locally, but Catherine mentioned there's also a need for some federal change. So, Deanna, I wonder if we'll start with you. Is there some form of hope now that there will be a change?
Absolutely. And there's been hope for a while. I mean, it's hard sometimes when it comes down to the when you look at it kind of individually and what may happen. Like you know, like if this concealed handgun permitless carry thing passes, I mean, I'm going to feel pretty hopeless for a couple of days. I'm not going to lie. But I look at my own story. So when I got involved in 2016, you know, after that fellow came for dinner, and I was like, oh my gosh, you know, what can I do? And a friend of mine had just joined Moms Demand Action. And so I went to my first Moms Demand Action meeting. And so I was invited to a gathering. There was a lawmaker from El Paso with this funny name, and he wanted to meet with some folks from Moms Demand Action to be able to ask if anybody had ever run on a platform of gun violence prevention in the state of Texas and won. And this was December 2016, and he had already been, you know, he was an elected representative from El Paso. And he was getting ready. The reason why he wanted to know is because he was getting ready to announce his run for Senate. And this is Beto O'Rourke, if you hadn't figured that out yet by now. But what's fascinating about this is so that in December 2016, he had no platform, right? Like he had run for office twice and never even had to worry about talking about gun violence prevention because it wasn't an issue. You know, up until Sandy Hook, there was not a very strong grassroots movement for gun violence prevention. That's the thing the NRA did right, was that they knew that if you wanted to shift policy, it wasn't enough to just go to Washington, D.C. and talk to lawmakers, that you also needed to have a grassroots movement. And so that's what they did. You know, they established chapters throughout the country, and they did so by you know, having picnics and inviting families to them. They built community. And so the gun violence prevention movement didn't have that. There really wasn't a counter. And so when you look at where we have shifted from basically 2017 to today, that now you have on a national level, you have folks that are running openly on gun violence prevention. This wouldn't have been a thing. This was talked about whenever Howard Dean, whenever he was running, or when he was the chair of the Democratic Party, somebody wanted to talk about gun violence prevention, and he said, absolutely not. That is a no deal. You cannot do that. There's a picture of John Kerry, and he had to pose with a rifle in order to run for president. Like it was something that had to be done in this country. It was expected that in order to run for office, you needed to be gun friendly. That has shifted. So it's not happening maybe as fast as we would have liked, but when you really look at the fact that the NRA has got a 20-year jump on us. I mean, really, they started in 1977 with the takeover of being politically active, building that grassroots movement. And so for really this to begin pretty heavily after 2016, and the real shift came even that I noticed after Parkland, and once the youth got really involved and active. And so the more people start to become involved and active, and the more that we are actively changing the narrative that says, you know what, we don't have to have guns. This isn't a given. You know, and that's what we're fighting against, something that has been normalized in our society. And so we have to continue to say no. And the last great kind of frontiers for the gun industry are schools and churches. And so that's why it's so important that churches get involved in this issue, and that they continue to say, you know, what about our First Amendment rights to be able to worship the way that we want to worship, to be able to gather for worship free from gun violence, to be able to gather free from guns. You know, that there's a lot that the churches can do here, and why it's so important that we get involved and be able to say, you know, there's a different story here, and there's a different narrative, and we don't have to live this way.
Mm-hmm. Mike, I wonder about the work that you do. Where are you seeing a lot of? I know you mentioned that there's so many organizations that speak into the legislative part, but and your work is a little bit different. But I wonder where you've seen some hope and change in the work that you're doing.
Yeah, I think, just this response after the Boulder shooting to see so many different churches. We've had congregants from different denominations up in Boulder all contact us wanting to do something, because sometimes it's hard to get a grasp on legislation and you want to do something with your hands. So whether that's picking up a hammer or donating a garden tool or helping be a part of disabling a gun, we have a national network we call our disarming network that Deanna mentioned earlier, where you can volunteer to help people disable their guns before they mail them to us. And we've seen an uptick in that over the last couple months as well. And a part of that are blacksmiths that are across the country that help us with this too. And so one of the things that I feel like is such a gift of the church is to model an alternative system. And so it's really amazing that we have things like police abolition curriculum. The Mennonite Church USA just released that. There is a curriculum coming out through Mennonite Central Committee, which is kind of like a disaster and relief arm of the Mennonite Church, about having a nonviolent response to an active shooter in your church space or in your corporate spaces, your home spaces, and kind of your day-to-day where you go by yourselves and your family. So there are these conversations that are continue to bubble up, but also that have the systemic support of curriculums and things like that throughout our churches. And I think that's a really important thing to be lifting up along with this advocacy, because then it starts to depoliticize the church, or I should not depoliticize, but kind of take the partisan talk out of it, right? Because what we're doing as a church is very political, because we're deciding and echoing how we decide to live together, and guns don't need to be a part of that. And so there's this really powerful narrative that churches can bring. We've seen that in the Black church and civil rights, right? That's how it was organized and the network was built, and helped the rest of us wake up. And so it's time to have the church have that kind of space as an example for us to find a different path forward. So when we're talking, it starts small in things like circles and dialogue training. Yesterday, I would help facilitate a circle training in a community of Colorado Springs that is traditionally over-policed and under-resourced. And it's really just providing space for people to bring pain to speech, but also solve our conflicts together in a community-based model like transformative justice, where we don't need the system to navigate our conflicts for us, but we can solve them on our own, and not just to kind of fix something, but to have this holistic piece that brings us to really respect each other, whether you're the victim offender or just kind of a disagreeing parties. That there's a lot of different spaces and creative ways for us to be able to move forward. And I think the church has an amazing opportunity here, and it's either we're going to be the quiet, moderate white church that does nothing, or we're going to be something that stands up in solidarity with those who have been victimized and survived some awful trauma of gun violence. That the church has all the gifts, talents, and funding. For sure, there's plenty of funding in the church to help make this happen. So as a way to kind of come alongside the efforts of legislation and advocacy, is to say that our church has polity already that recognizes the love of our enemy and the love of our neighbor. And we got triggers in our hearts and triggers in our streets, and when we combine those things, we need help. So I think all of the things that Catherine and Dina have mentioned are 100% where we're moving. And I have so much hope because I see the church beginning to speak up, and it takes a long time to build a system that is counter to what we're seeing in the gun culture.
And Catherine, where are you finding hope in your work?
Before I answer that, I just want to build off of Mike's comments a little bit and name that as a member of the Jewish community here in Pittsburgh, the intersection of faith and gun violence is very real and very obvious. I was in Pittsburgh about 1.5 miles away from the Tree of Life Synagogue when the massacre in 2018 took place there. And I watched our city come come together and stand behind the Jewish community in a way that I hadn't seen. People come and stand behind other people in tragedy before ever. And I think especially our, Muslim brothers and sisters in Pittsburgh really came out and showed up for us. And it really showed me the power of faith-based advocacy and, interfaith coalitions, and what we can do when we embrace the center of all of our doctrines is to love thy neighbor. And that means not just showing up for one another after tragedy, but having enough love for one another to work together day in and day out to build safer communities where we don't have to turn up to mourn mass shootings together, where we don't have to show up at the bedside as someone who has been the victim of a shooting, when we don't have to have these conversations and do this work. So I think there's really a proactive piece there that faith communities have a distinct opportunity to step into and to embrace. And I also think, having seen also the way that the Reformed Jewish community does, politically engaged work, I would definitely agree that there is so much power in being able to walk into an elected official's office, whether it's in the US Congress or your, city hall, and to say, I'm a person of faith. This is what my doctrine says about loving one another, about nonviolence, about, not standing idly by while our neighbor's blood is shed. And this is what I think our community needs. And here's how we can prevent violence and live more faithful, loving, compassionate lives. And that holds a kind of power that a partisan argument never will. And obviously that type of doctrine, that type of argument has to be placed in conversation, with public health approaches to preventing gun violence, and the ongoing work of community organizers and public health professionals. But at the end of the day, there's something so incredibly compelling about people from different backgrounds with different beliefs coming together to say, okay, we are different, but at our core, this is what we care about. This is how we want to protect our community. And this is what we're going to keep showing up for until it happens. And so I just wanted to name that and to say that that's so powerful, and that the faith community has a really incredible opportunity here to stand up and to take the chance to be the mouthpiece for this work that often, gets relegated to a hyper-partisan box where it gets stuck, which is exactly what the people who sell the guns want to happen. So be part of disrupting that, be part of changing what it means to be a gun violence prevention activist and to be a person of faith in the United States. And so seeing that start to come to life, seeing conversations like this, that all brings me a lot of hope and a lot of joy. The thing that I am most excited about, I started to see in communities across the country, coalitions of everyone from middle and high school GVP organizers who are planning school walkouts, all the way through, community elders who've been doing this work for decades and decades and decades, coming together to, challenge cities to literally rewrite in city codes what public safety is, creating a community-based definition of such, so that public safety budgets can be allocated to after school programs and to elder care and to mental health services instead of to police and juvenile detention, and thinking about how those things make our communities safer too. And so I think seeing how people are starting to form quote unquote unlikely coalitions to really redefine and reshape what public safety is, and the way that guns, police, prisons, and state violence don't fit into that, is incredibly helpful and powerful.
Thank you, Catherine. And we have 1 minute, but we'll take 2, just so that you all can do a 30-second wrap up. Again, thank you for being here. Thank you for this conversation. This dialogue is very timely and important, and is vital to not only our communities, but the church. So I want to have you all give a 30-second closing remarks. Also, during that time, you can lift up any resources that you might have, or any encouraging words for people who are just starting to do this work, or who would like to engage in this work, and how they can connect and lobby in their communities, or accompany people who are going through these tragic times. So I'll start with Catherine, then Mike, and then I'll end with Deanna.
Sure. So, Not My Generation can always use support. Again, we're a coalition of young adult organizers across the country who are doing this work day in and day out on a volunteer basis. We are looking to, center our local work even more. So if you are a young person around 26 and under, please join a coalition. Step up as a local leader. We will train you. We will work with you. We'll answer your questions. Organizing and activism is for everybody, which means it's for you. So step up, and we'd love if you would step up with us. I dropped a link that's going to be shared to join our local coalitions, but also always you can follow us on social media at NMG_GVP, where we post information about one-off opportunities like phone banks and legislative alerts and learning. But of course, there's always direct action as well. And if you're someone who's a little bit older and you have the resources, I know it's a little taboo to talk about, but donate to the organizations who are doing the work. We could always use your support, but there are also youth coalitions, mutual aid funds, bail funds in every state around the country. So look them up. If you need help finding them, let us know. Not My Generation, we will help you find those people because they need your support.
Yeah, if you want to find out more about Raw Tools, you can go to rawtools.org. One of the things we're excited about is now that COVID is kind of winding down, crossing my fingers, we're starting to plan more events where if you want a gun to garden tool demonstration in your area, we'd love to come and visit you in your space. We can also do a lot of this outdoors. So even if there's we need to do some sort of hybrid event, that's entirely possible. One of the things I failed to mention earlier, our mission is to disarm hearts, forge peace, and cultivate justice. And so while we are working for a world with less guns, we're also working for a world that has the systems in place to help us deal with our conflict in a peaceful and life-giving way with our neighbors in our community. So I appreciate the time here with all of y'all. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, so there should be a link to go to presbypeacefellowship.org, and there we have a congregational toolkit, and you can download that for free, and it gives lots of ideas of what you can do in your congregation, in your church, and lots of resources that are in that congregational toolkit. And also we are the Peace Fellowship is a separate 501c3. It is not part of the denominational structure. So we also rely on the financial gifts from individual donors. So you can also make a donation while you are at that link. And I just want to say that on Saturday, I went out and I bought my chop saw. And so on Saturday, I will be disarming my first gun. So I am pretty excited about that. And then we'll be sending it to Raw Tools.
Awesome. Well, thank y'all so much for being here. And all the links that everyone has mentioned are in the comments. So that'll show up on Facebook. It'll be on Twitter. It'll be on YouTube. So all those links are right there. I also wanted to mention the Peace USA resource webinar, Standing Our Holy Ground, is also a resource that has been used often. And our friend Simon Doong had a lot to do with that. And we're also on a podcast, so we'll just throw that out there. A Matter of Faith, the Presby podcast. Go follow it. Subscribe. But thank y'all so much for being here. And for everyone out there who was watching, who has been impacted by gun violence, who has lost a loved one, who is mourning and grieving, we are with you and we stand with you, and we will continue to do this work as we are called to do as people of faith. And so thank y'all so much for this conversation and for doing the work that y'all do. And we will hold you in our prayers as you continue that work. But yeah, that concludes our episode. Check us out next week, same time, same place. We will be talking about purity culture next week, so get ready for that conversation. And again, thank you to our guests, and we will see you next week.